So we will continue with an important area that also has unique benefits from patient-generated health data, and that is rare diseases. We will have 3 case presentations and a panel discussion, similar to the last session. Let's start with the first presentation from Pamela Gavin at Nord. I see she's taking a second to come on, so I'm going to introduce the rest of the panel that will be here shortly after. We'll have Jesse Backer, Tracy Gray from FDA, Christina Go from Actigraph, and Kristen Sawalski from Clario. So whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away, Pam.
Jackie, thank you for sharing that. While we wait for Pam, we'll ask if Kristen is somewhere where she can start the presentation a little bit earlier. And thank you for the flexibility, team. Kristen, please go ahead and present, and I'll pull up the slide shortly.
Absolutely.
While you're pulling up the slide, Kristen's presentation is developing a multi-sensor digital movement analysis system for ataxia. Kristen, we're excited to have you. And
Thank you.
Your slides are being pulled up shortly.
Perfect.
Feel free to introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to present today. My name is Kristen Sawalski. I am the Vice President for both product and science for our movement science division at Clario, which we call Precision Motion. And excited to share with you today how we incorporated patient-generated health data when developing a multi-sensor digital movement analysis system for ataxia. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so when developing a device, you need to have a concept of interest, right? And so I highly advise developing a tool around a concept of interest that you and your team are very passionate about, right? It's a long journey, a very rewarding one, but it does take some hard work and come with challenges. So it does help when you're very passionate about the area that you're working in. So we chose ours as mobility, right? The ability to have balance and gait to move around in your daily life, as it's a critical determinant of health and quality of life. It's very relatable, right, this topic. As we all know, if mobility becomes impaired, it reduces our independence, it increases our risks of injury. We see higher rates of hospitalizations and overall raising healthcare costs. But most importantly, it impacts the patient, right, mentally, socially, and physical. So this is a very important concept of interest to further research. So this can be applied broadly, but also can definitely be applied into rare disease. And so the case study that I'm utilizing today is ataxia. We've done work in both spinocerebellar ataxia as well as Friedreich's. So if you see here, balance impairment is the most commonly reported symptom in ataxia, which leads to less functional independence and lower quality of life. And the stats reveal that 93% of cerebellar ataxic patients fall every year. And of fallers, 85% of those fallers report related injuries. So it's common sense that improvements in gait and balance are meaningful outcomes for people with ataxia. Okay, so how are these concepts of interest currently measured? Well, the standard is through clinical outcome assessments, right? So in ataxia, we see the SARA, the scale for the assessment rating of ataxia, and the International Cooperative Ataxia Rating Scale. So these scales are great in that they're identifying these key concepts. You can see gait and balance or stance as the top 2 questions in the SARA. We get even more narrowed down and defined in the International Cooperative Ataxia Rating Scale, where you see it as walking capacities, were defined as gait speed, standing capacities, and it goes on, right? So the concepts are being targeted, but there are limitations to these scales because they're coarse-grained, they're ordinal, they're subjective, right? And because of that, they require expertise. And so we do see poor inter and intra-rater reliability. So there's room for improvement there. So we saw that as an unmet need, and that we need to really measure movement directly and objectively. So our solution that we wanted to develop was developing wearable sensors that you can place on different segments of the body to measure movement precisely for digital outcome measures of movement that can be used to fulfill this unmet need. All right, so this was our process to go from development of a device through research grade device all the way through to medical grade device. So obviously guidance, right, from the FDA, and DIME has some wonderful resources. They have had them along the way, and then continue to update them now to refer to throughout this process. So for us, we went through 2 to 3 years of device development of the wearable sensor. We have full stack engineering team with hardware, software, algorithms. And then once the device is developed, you want to make sure that you are measuring what you say you are measuring, right? So that's that verification or that technical validation. So utilizing existing systems such as optical motion capture technologies, force plates, gate mats, things of that nature to demonstrate that you are measuring indeed what you are saying that you measure. Once that's established, it's important to go through different phases of scientific validation in healthy controls and indications of choice. So you want to make sure that your endpoints that your device produces are reliable, they're repeatable. They have the ability to discriminate between different populations, particularly healthy from the intended indication. And then probably most important when looking at drug development is sensitive to change, right? If you have a disease modifying therapy, you want to be selecting an outcome that is sensitive to that indication and sensitive to change so that you can measure the effectiveness and safety of your therapeutic. So this was our process to go through from a research grade device with all of this evidence, and then we became a medical grade device as FDA class 2 and CE class 1. So now that you have the device made, right, and that's essentially saying this device is safe to use and effective to use in these populations. So, but we want to make sure to narrow that down to the rare disease ataxia and want to make sure that we are developing outcome measures that are fit for purpose and are meaningful to patients. So we turn to the voice of the patient meetings to gather information around this. So in parallel with the FDA-led patient-focused drug development efforts, there is support of externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. There have been 2 of them of late with ataxia. So in 2017, there was one that was highly focused around Friedreich's ataxia, of which about 400 people attended. From that meeting, you see that 86% of patients who participated reported challenges with both balance and walking. And then the 3 symptoms that affected daily life the most were claimed as imbalance, difficulty with coordination, and fatigue. And then in 2020, there was another voice of the patient meeting put on, highly focused around spinal cerebellar ataxia and others. And in that meeting, it was found that the top 3 symptoms that matter most to patients were, again, balance, impaired mobility, and then coordination. And difficulty walking was identified as the largest challenge to activities of daily living. So these stats are important to notice, but I think what really hits home for most people, I know it does for me, are the quotes that have come out of these meetings, right? So the top one, we have a mother who's speaking of her child, saying that the worst part is the loss of his ability to walk. He is left behind. It is hard to see him getting to where the other kids are. But by then, the kids are going somewhere else. He just wants to fit in. And then voice of the patients themselves. I would love to take walks outside, but I'm afraid of falling with no one to help me. And another patient, it's getting harder and harder to even prepare a meal because of my balance and lack of coordination. So we want to make sure that with our technology, we are capturing the right outcome assessments to measure these core concepts that matter to patients. So fortunately, we have a very strong team and we've got some wonderful collaborators in the field that have been capturing this data for some time to get to the point where we are today. So we have our internal scientific leaders, Dr. Chris Gomez, Faye Horick, James McNames, and Vrutang Shah, really experts in this area around ataxia, around gait and balance, around signal processing and analyzing these types of data. And our team has worked with a broad range of experts in this area, both at the Ataxia Global Initiative and the National Ataxia Foundation. And there's been a great paper that came out with another one of our, authored primarily by one of our authors, or I'm sorry, our collaborators, Dr. Winfried Ilg, with the whole group, with advisory on what to measure in clinical trials or clinical research for ataxia. This includes the use of a 2-minute walk test and standing balance test. And you can see we want to be measuring these things early, right? We have it for ambulatory patients with ataxia, and then we have recommendations for pre-ataxic patients. So on the bottom right, what you'll see is how we measure balance. So this is measured off of a sensor just placed on the lower back, and these are called stabilograms. So you can see what the amount of sway is back and forth, sort of front to back with a patient, and then side to side. So in the first figure, that's the healthy control. We've got a nice healthy measure of this back and forth swaying motion, or forward and back, very minimal side to side. Now in pre-manifest SCA, we see that sway area expand more medial to lateral, and then manifest SCA, which is spinocerebellar ataxia, we see that expands quite a bit, right? So these are difficult things to truly capture with the human eye, but simply by adding one sensor and having a participant stand still for 30 seconds, you can have this objective data to track. Now, as far as gait goes, the gait measures are now demonstrating that they are able to discriminate participants with ataxia from healthy controls. Also, these measures correlate with the SARA, right? In these measures, we have multi-sensor system, but as we narrow it down, we want to identify which of the sensors are most important. We don't want everyone wearing multiple sensors all the time. So we have been identifying that the most important data in this rare indication is coming from the sensor on the foot, and that these are the measures that discriminate participants from healthy controls. We also want it to correlate to the standard clinical scale, the SARA, right? So we can see that there is a correlation, but we don't want that correlation to be perfect, because if it's perfect, the wearable sensor is not providing extra data, additional information, right? But we see there's a relationship, but not quite perfect, because it is adding an extra benefit that we don't get with these conventional scales alone. So now we're very excited because we're at the point where now these measures coming from the feet are demonstrating that their ability to capture 1 year of progression in early stage spinocerebellar ataxia when the classical scale, the SARA, does not. So what does that mean? That means there is potential there to reduce the size and really the duration of clinical trials, right? You've got a measure that's very precise, very sensitive. And so here's some data demonstrating that. So we're very excited about the stages is that to really help benefit trials. This is simply done with a 2-minute walk test. Now, the data that I presented so far is in a clinical setting or a controlled setting, right? But the next level, of course, particularly with patient-generated health data, is we want to see what these measures do out in the real world in daily life. So we have 2 efforts going on in this area, same sensors, right? The approved medical grade devices. Using that multi-sensor solution in the real world. So we want to, again, minimize the number of sensors to decrease patient burden if they're responsible for placing them themselves in the real world. So we have one on each foot for the multi-sensor approach, and there's very promising evidence coming out of some of our collaborators' labs demonstrating that lateral step deviation and spatial variability are also sensitive, distinguishing between healthies and controls. Now, that lateral step deviation is a measure that can likely make sense to everybody. So when you're walking with healthy gait, you have normal tracking of your feet pretty much in parallel, right? But in ataxia, there's difficulty balancing, difficulty with coordination, and it's that classic drunken gait, right? So instead of that nice straight path, you're going to be seeing lateral deviations of that because of that lack of stability while progressing forward. So we're seeing this measure as very promising to both help determine progression ahead of clinical scales, and we're seeing evidence of this being usable in a real world environment. And then we've got other collaborators to start deploying new algorithms and that have potential to apply in ataxia as well. But moving forward, right throughout the whole process, we've really wanted to incorporate what matters to patients most while developing. But also now that the tools have been developed, we want to make sure that we're capturing the patient voice simultaneously while we have these measures in the home. So it's important to capture this precise movement data and then have things like ePros to capture the patient's voice to relate the data to make sure, even if we're getting a change in these measures, does that matter to a patient's life? So that's it for me, and thanks very much for your time.
Kristen, thank you so much for that talk. I very much enjoyed the looking to patients and realizing the need to measure movements directly and reliably, and then the added benefit of the sensors so that we get information that we did not get with conventional data collection alone. And I really enjoyed the theme of engaging with patients throughout the product development and not just at the beginning. I think we've heard a lot about that in previous sessions. Finally, another theme that came up that reminded me of the previous sessions was the potential to reduce the size and duration of clinical trials by engaging patients and patient-generated health data. So thank you very much for that presentation.
Thank you.
So next, we will have Pamela Gavin, who is Chief Executive Officer at NORD. So Pam, please take it away.
Hi there. Good to be with everyone today. I'd like to begin by expressing my gratitude for participating in this workshop, and start with just giving folks a bit of an orientation for who NORD is, to the extent that you aren't aware. NORD's mission is really focused on improving the health and well-being of people living with rare diseases, and we do that through really looking at the intersection of advances in medical care, accelerating research, and making improvements and changes in policy positions that would improve people's lives. We're an independent 501c3, which means we do not have drug or device manufacturers on our board, although we do partner with them as very critical stakeholders in the community. Some of you may not be familiar with what a rare disease is. In the United States, the Orphan Drug Act defines rare diseases as populations of people affected by a condition where the population is 200,000 people or less. As you would probably assume if you weren't familiar, most of those folks have a genetic origin to their condition, although not all. And you would also likely consider that to have an impact, a profound impact on children. When a condition is genetic in nature, it tends to lead to really severe illness, severe impact on quality of life, and early fatality. So clearly, people in the community often are incredibly motivated to engage in change that it could improve their lives. So what does that mean for people living with rare conditions as it relates to device use? There are really a wide array of devices used by the community, and unique use cases and challenges that rare disease patients face. Many rare disease patients have conditions that impact multiple organ systems and their ability to navigate their day-to-day living. They must often use multiple devices in concert with one another, which, as you can imagine, adds a layer of complexity and challenges to the user experience. And patients frequently become increasingly dependent over time. Many of these conditions are chronic, and the need for them starts off being slight and continues to progress. I'd like to spend just a moment here speaking to you about two programs that NORD operates that really help to support device manufacturers and in their efforts to develop treatments and capacity to improve patients' lives. The first is NORD's I Am Rare registry program. And that is a program that was meant initially to help patient communities, people affected by rare diseases, play a larger role in contributing to drug and device development, and also contributing collectively to their understanding of how these conditions evolve over time. When a condition is rare, you often have very few experts understand its progression, understand the burden of the disease, understand or be able to predict or share with patients and families what's going to happen over time. So our I Am Rare program is often defined as a registry program, but it allows you to establish studies, web-based studies, and have patients and caregivers and legally authorized representatives participate along with clinicians in this virtual world. The program in particular was designed to support natural history studies because of the need to understand how things evolve and progress over time. So the complication with engaging with a community virtually is something that was taken into consideration as we developed the program. And with our centers of excellence, NORD has over 40 network members around the country that are, committed to not only the diagnosis and care and treatment of people living with rare diseases, but they are often academic centers that have some of the only research being conducted on these rare conditions. And of course, they are critical players in the execution of clinical trials in our efforts to lead to finally access to these treatments and products that people desperately need. So what do they have in common? They both are focused on data collected through their programming, and they can help with that effort in the development process, as the slide shows, and as well as the validation of regulatory tools like clinical outcomes assessments, biomarker tests, diagnostic imaging for non-clinical assessments, for example. Both programs help manufacturers develop new devices faster and better, incorporating patient preferences earlier in the development process, or by even identifying patients that may be applicable for a trial. As I mentioned in an earlier slide, in referencing from the rare disease community's perspective, device use and how the use of devices play a role in patients' lives. Here I'm diving a little bit deeper into highlighting some of the challenges that rare disease patients face. And they really speak in many instances to equity. With multiple organ systems affected often, there's a lot of reliance on multiple devices, and patients may be limited in their ability to use complex devices. And prolonged use brings in challenges of their own with, for example, device lifetimes like battery life, software compatibility, and they can become increasingly difficult and challenging for people over time, especially if a patient is dependent on a single specific device. And as you can imagine, over time, issues around supply shortages and discontinuation of parts, they also contribute to the challenges that affect patients' lives and their ability to go about their day-to-day living. NORD has conducted several listening sessions, and with that in our work with our communities, engaging them on registries and other kinds of activities, we've really learned a lot and will continue to learn. And the key for us is to incorporate some of those learnings, not only for ourselves in NORD's work, but our member organizations and our partners and stakeholders that we work with to improve the lives of people living with rare diseases. It takes significantly more resources and planning than you would expect to reach historically underserved and marginalized communities. And once you do, it often takes significant time to build those relationships and trust. We've also learned that no two communities or even patients, much less patients rather, face the same barriers to care and treatment. And patients are the experts on their own experience. And it's on NORD, FDA, industry, all of us to meet these communities where they are and to build the trust and learn from patients to make products and resources that meet their needs. Some of the recommendations that come from that, I think, are completely appropriate and self-explanatory, but to ahead of time think about and know your blind spots, set realistic expectations, and start by asking those who've been historically left out. Spend a moment with you on a tactical approach that NOR took on a project to increase access. Is really supported by our natural history study that we did for metachromatic leukodystrophy called the HOME study. And that study reinforced findings that are articulated here on this slide. The HOME study, one of the goals of the HOME study really was to attest a framework for designing a remote study that could be used in a variety of rare diseases, even though we were focusing on MLD for the project itself. And it was important to understand that participants' likelihood of joining remote versus in-person studies and the durations they would be agreeable to. Respondents in this study had mixed responses about whether they'd be willing to participate in a study that operated in person. Those subsequent comments indicated that it would depend on how far they would need to travel. Still, others stated any travel would be too laborious given the medical condition of their participant. For remote study participation, respondents overwhelmingly were agreeable to longer durations of participation than the 12 to 14 months of engagement with the home study. Patients have unique insights, but we have to ask the right questions. And in many instances, it isn't just the patient, but the caregivers that need to be not just to intentionally brought into the design and considered a part of that entire effort. And there's definitely inherent tension between the complexity of a topic area and the time that patients have and their ability to engage in. So the thoughtful planning of bringing them into the mix in the design phase is really, really very important, and providing the appropriate background to understand why things are being designed the way they are, why they're being asked to engage in the way they're being asked to engage, and clearly understanding their role and expectations. And I neglected to mention in the previous slide, it's also very important, especially when you're dealing with not just advocates, but patients in the community who may not be well versed to understanding, what is this regulatory framework that we're operating with. They have limited knowledge about research. They have limited knowledge about the roles of regulatory science in the conduct of the trial. So those things need to be taken into consideration as well, and make sure that people are familiar, in this case, with device regulation, and you're speaking using the appropriate language and speaking to them where they are, so that they can really, if they're interested in engaging, that's your first step in recognizing that they're willing to learn and listen and participate.
Thank you so much, Pam. Thank you for that presentation. Now we will have our third presentation for this session and then go into a discussion with the panelists. So our next presentation will be Christine Go. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm Christine Gu. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer from Actigraph. And so for those of you who don't know, Actigraph, we provide service and support to the use of digital health technology to collect patient-generated health data in the development of medical product. So what I like to share with you is our journey to getting the first FDA endorsed primary endpoint using digital health technology, and what are the lessons we learned from this journey. Next. So first, I just kind of want to highlight why we're so interested in digital health technology, especially sensor-based. I think in particular in the context, sorry, there's a bit of a formatting change, but on the right-hand side are some of the key benefits that we see by deploying sensor-based digital health technology in clinical trials, right? We can now collect data remotely, so this really reduces barrier to enrollment. We can have objective measure to improve the measurement property and reduce biases. And also that right now, I think we don't have a great tools to measure how patients really function in their real world, real life. And sensor-based technologies really offer us unprecedented opportunity to be able to review those insights that are otherwise invisible to us. So I think that since we're talking about rare disease, you can see many of those benefits are particularly important in the development of in the clinical research in rare diseases. So next slide. And that is where, in our experience, when we look at all the clinical trials that we support using digital health technology, using wearables, about half of them are focusing on developing medical products in rare diseases. So this really reinforces that the unmet need in rare disease is something that is very appealing to the use of the potential of using digital health technology. But this is something that is still quite new. There's a lot of unknown and confusion about what is the right path of evidence generation to get us to regulatory accepted clinical endpoint. So this is where I'll share with you kind of our journey in using digital health technology in the development of medical product in idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis as an example, and share with you guys the lessons learned there. Next slide. So this is a research that we have in this particular cardiopulmonary condition. It is a very rare disease, and it's characterized by scarring fibrosis in the lung, and this is irreversible and progressive. And patients typically manifest in chronic cough and decreased lung function, short of breath, etc. And some of this will eventually become fatal. Next slide, please. So this is basically the background, right? The indication that we have started on, we launched on this journey with Bellerophon Therapeutics. So on the top right here, you see this is Peter Fernandez, the CEO of Bellerophon Therapeutics, ex-CEO of Bellerophon Therapeutics. He's also going to be part of the panelists in the next session. And so he will be also sharing his perspective on this journey, but just want to highlight that this is a very much a collaboration that we got on with Bellerophon Therapeutics. And as we talk a lot about in this session, it is very important to start a journey thinking about, are we imagining something that is ultimately meaningful to the patient? So here is FDA actually hold this Voice of the Patient session with the idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis patient back in 2015. And through this Voice of Patient session, we really learned that physical activity is something that is very important and meaningful to the patient. When cough and shortness of breath are some of the key symptoms in this population, physical activity is one of the leading triggers to the onset of those symptoms. So this Voice of the Patient report is very important to demonstrate to the community, the researchers, the regulator, that physical activity is a meaningful clinical outcome in this patient population. Next slide. And on the other hand, physical activity is one of the most common sensor-based measures in clinical and public health research, dating back to even the 70s, that the researchers has been using accelerometer as a sensor to objectively quantify physical activity. And there are several fundamental characteristics of physical activity we can characterize, and in particular, the intensity of physical activity is one of the most studied measures using accelerometer, using a wearable device. And next slide. And this is where that when we had done a lot of work together with Peter at Bellerophon Therapeutics to discuss what are the opportunities for us to assess physical activity in this population. And some of the measures that we have on the right-hand side are, I think you are very familiar with, right? 6-minute walk, activity, pulmonary function, etc. But a lot of them are not really to identify and quantify physical activity in patients' everyday life. Whereas a wearable-derived physical activity can provide a direct assessment of how the patients are actually going along with their physical activity in daily life. So this is basically the motivation for us to include actigraphy as a measurement for the clinical trial in idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. And next slide. And just for also for the audience to know that some of the discussions about the opportunity actigraphy provide as a direct measure of clinical outcome and functional outcome in this population has been discussed in this review paper that I have highlighted here, co-authored by several members of a very active consortia that Peter perhaps would mention, as well as Norman Stockbridge from the FDA. I would highly recommend you to check out this review paper that have discussed what are the opportunities by thinking about new measures for the treatment in cardiopulmonary condition. And next slide. So here I want to kind of summarize some of the key evidence that went into the decision and discussion with the regulator on why we want to use actigraphy as a clinical outcome assessment. So again, as we mentioned, always start with the patient. We start with understanding that the activity of daily living is meaningful to the patient population we're targeting at here. And as I mentioned, that we have a long literature supporting the use of wearable technology to measure physical activity in real world. And also that in the phase 2 study, early phase study of this journey, we have identified that physical activity measure, especially moderate to vigorous physical activity, can identify treatment-related response in the early phase of study. And also based on the literature, we know that 10 to 20% change is reported to be clinically important in this population. So these are some of the key evidence that went into the package when we discussed with FDA on what are the clinical trial design should be for the pivotal trial in this particular clinical development program. Next slide. So here is a summary of the design of the pivotal 3 trial that Rarity launched about 2 or 3 years ago. And basically, FDA had accepted use a moderate to vigorous physical activity as derived by the wearable device as a primary endpoint for this phase 3 study. And also that we were asked to conduct additional validation study of the clinical meaningful change of the MVPA by anchor-based approach. And also that we were able to reduce the sample size of the study by 50% to half by using moderate to vigorous physical activity as compared to previously defined 6-minute walk. So this is some of the sort of key elements that went into that conversation. And the FDA had agreed to the study design and endorsed the use of physical activity derived by actigraphy as the primary endpoint. And furthermore, actually, we also got the FDA equivalent agency in China to agree with this clinical design as well. So next slide. However, after the conduction of the trial, it was unfortunate that we could not find any change in the treatment of this trial. As you know, I'm sure very well that so this is a drug trial, and 50% of the phase 3 trial eventually failed. So this, unfortunately, is also one of the example where the phase 3 could not confirm the positive result we saw in the early trial. And I would like to sort of highlight that basically all of the endpoint, either traditional or novel, did not show a statistically significant change. So it was very disappointing for us, of course, that we couldn't deliver a treatment to the patient and community. But nonetheless, I think this journey was very important for us to think about the use of digital health technology data as a clinical endpoint in clinical development. Next slide, please. And furthermore, to kind of support the use of digital health technology, as I mentioned, that we also conducted anchor-based analysis in this study, and we were able to see that there is a clear separation when we separate patient groups by patient-reported outcome to show that the patient who said that they feel much better after the trial did show more physical activity versus patient report they feel much worse, that they end up with less physical activity to support the clinical meaningfulness of this novel measure. Next slide. So here are just a kind of summary of the takeaway, right? And so DHT-derived measures can be used as a patient-centric endpoint in registration trials as a direct measure of functional outcome. But Rarity and this collaboration was the first to make the step forward. While the clinical trial and therapy did not work, they were able to not only make a faster decision and also demonstrate to the community what is possible by working with the regulator on this journey. And I think some the scientific and clinical significance has been visible to the community and has been documented in the literature, as I highlighted previously. I think that we also have demonstrated that it is very much feasible to deploy digital health technology in primary endpoint to collect data with very high operational excellence. And finally, just to kind of echoing a lot of discussion we have here, patient centricity is really critical for this path forward. I think the example that the case study I just shared, where we really leverage FDA's patient report, patient-focused drug development resource, the voice of the patient report, to help move this field forward. And here I showed a QR code here. We're building a database to help connect the dots between the patient voice and novel digital endpoint, and then to help us to expand and generalize this learning to other indications. So that's all I like to share, and thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you so much for that presentation, and thank you to all of our presenters. So I'll now turn it over to the panel discussion on rare diseases. The discussion will be moderated by Jessie. Jessie, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. And as always, it's lovely to be part of an FDA DIME event like this. So my name is Jessie Backer, VP of Clinical Development at Connexa Health. I'll begin with a sincere thanks to all three presenters. Some really wonderful insights there from three very different stakeholder perspectives. You've certainly made my job easier as moderator by giving us lots to think about. Before we dive in, I'd like to introduce Tracy Gray, Patient Engagement Lead at FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health, who's joining us as part of the panel. So Tracy, I'll hand over to you in just a moment to introduce yourself and also speak to our first question, which I'd like to pose to the full group as well. Where do you see a need within rare diseases that's currently unmet that you see as offers potential for greater use of patient-generated health data as a tool?
Thank you so much, Jessie, and it's my pleasure to join you all this afternoon. It's been such a fabulous workshop. I'm the Patient Engagement Lead in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, and I work closely with our device teams to foster a culture of patient engagement throughout this center, as well as collaborate with other peers within the agency. So regarding the rare disease space and fostering and really looking at how what is the role of patients in patient-generated health data and some of the challenges. We know that it's well documented that in clinical trials, there's low enrollment of diverse populations, and a lot of burdens for patients in participating in trials can include time to travel to clinical sites, as we've heard from many of the speakers today, as well as the number and length of procedures that they have to undergo once they're at the site, as well as complexity of those procedures, and some of them may even be deemed unnecessary. So oftentimes some members or patients may find that they lose wages because of the burden of the time commitment and participating in trials. And then sometimes patients may find that those primary and secondary endpoints that are being used are not meaningful to them. We've heard some great information about how patient-generated health data could really help to inform in that area. So these challenges are magnified when you consider the complexities of the rare disease community, as Pamela went over a few minutes ago. They already have many burdens, but when you layer that on top of those already existing clinical trial challenges, it's even more so for the rare disease community. So the use of patient-generated health data to address these challenges, making decentralized clinical trial participation more feasible. It can ease trial burden on patients by reducing the amount of on-site data collection and the amount of time that's spent at a clinical site, making it possible for more individuals, diverse populations, as well as those with complex conditions to be able to participate. Also possibly reducing the amount of lost wages that patients may encounter. And patient data collection and the ability to report on outcomes that are important to patients may be more timely and may represent real-time data inputs, more robust data that can extend beyond just one particular time and be more meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. That was a wonderful way to kick off our discussion as a good reminder that the tools that generate these data can do a lot more for us, for patients, for the field than only endpoints. So maybe Christine, you're next on my Zoom vision. Can I come to you with the same question, please? Do you see an area of unmet need that we can address?
Yeah, absolutely. As I highlighted in my starting slides, right? Like just by the default of unmet need, that 50% of the trials that we support come from the rare disease research community. And I think this really highlights that a lot of times we don't have very fit for purpose outcome measures in this population, and we need to look for new ways to measure it. And then also that I think has already been discussed, right? Patients with rare disease, a lot of times it's really not easy for them to participate in trials because of the logistic challenges. And that we need to reach to more population, more patients, because it's hard to find, a lot of patient population live very close to a clinical site. So it is something that we have to be able to collect data and reduce the barrier for them to participate in the clinical trial. And also that, a lot of times rare conditions affect the pediatric population. So it is difficult for them to give response, perhaps a lot of times like a patient-reported outcome and collect data as in adult trials. And in our experience, by using a wearable technology, it really allows us to collect objective measure that perhaps is more impactful in some of this research.
Thanks, Christine. I'm really glad you brought up pediatrics as well. Pediatric rare disease, we heard about it as part of the presentation. There are additional challenges there, but of course that is aligned with greater need in many cases. Pam, if I can hand over to you for discussion of greatest unmet need where we can really move the needle.
I think I would just expand a little bit on the home study that I mentioned earlier. This was NORD sent tablets and people use phones, and instead of spending time, this was all remote. Obviously, it was it was a natural history study, so it was driven by patient-reported data versus other types of studies. But the whole point of this was to address it's a pediatric illness. It affects the entire family. Mobility is a huge issue. It progresses very quickly, and we invested in clinical trial nurses and research coordinators and to communicate via Zoom videotaping experiences. So not only could we get people's perceptions of their experiences, but we can get the caregiver's perception, a perspective as well, but we also had the video. So you can go back and compare to the point that Christine was making. Is your perception of capacity the same as a clinical expert's interpretation? So we tested lots of different theories and themes, and we used a handheld device as well, or a mobile app that people could use their phone to also compare their satisfaction with the process. So we measured the process, we followed them for 12 to 14 months, and then we also evaluated their perceptions. And those kinds of approaches seem, as we become more technologically advanced, really basic, but for somebody living in a remote location, they're not basic. They're really valuable, and the amount of time and energy you want to place up front to ensure that the equipment is set up correctly and people are ready to go. And then we met people when it was convenient for them, after work, after dinner, or at a time when the child was more alert or there was less burden on the family because the impact of the disease is so significant that it's like an all hands on deck just to manage the disease on a day in, day out basis. When are they going to have clinical care in the home? When would that make it easier for them to participate? All went into the design, and not that we knew all of it up front, but we did work with a committee of experts, both caregivers, patients, and clinicians, industry in the design process, and it helped us to kind of evaluate and assess those theories that we had that we wanted to pursue in advance. I think in the field of rare disease, understanding what impact there is so much more information that we can garner that is outside of the inpatient setting and the outpatient clinic setting that we need when it comes to rare, that we need to make sure we can tap into. And the patients and the caregivers, the families play an important role in getting that, digitizing that experience, if you will.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Pam. You mentioned user satisfaction, a lot of usability related topics there, and you've planted a seed. I want to come back to that in just a moment. But Kristen, would love to hear from you.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's echoing a lot of what's already been said. But in the case of rare disease such as ataxia, the patients are fewer, they're spread out. So we know that that is a big burden, right? So, and we've been testing in clinic, but we're working towards, less sensors so that they can be deployed in the home so that they're worn during their normal life. It's not causing something new, right? So I think it's important that we continue that effort to go in that direction. But it's also, as I mentioned, really important to capture the patient's voice while this technology is in the home, right? Because do these measures relate to what they're feeling? Did they, when we get further and further into mobility, they can, have a journal of did I fall, yes or no? And you might be able to look at mobility data of measures that were impaired leading up to that, but it's confirmation of events like that you can correlate. The other thing is we really need to assess whether the use of home technology is truly less burdensome to them. I think it's important because there is some burden, no matter what you do by sending technology home with a participant, that is it worth it to them to have it in the home? Is that easier? Or do they prefer traveling to the site because it's less responsibility? So I think it's really important to just keep capturing that patient's voice along, the entire way, because there's going to be a balance of what's deployable in the home that's sensitive enough to actually, show efficacy of something versus something that may be better off in the clinic. So it's just very, very important to continue to capture that voice with the use of phones and ePros and things like that with these devices while they're in the home until we have a better understanding.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. You brought up another really important point there around burden. We talk a lot about the potential of digital tools to reduce burden, but we don't often talk about the burden that they present and the balance between those things. So yeah, another aspect of usability for sure. So I'd like to keep on this topic of usability as we've had a lot of really useful information come out in the last several months. Of course, as this audience is very well aware, FDA finalized their DHT guidance in December, which it was wonderful to see a dedicated section on usability. And of course, within Data CC, the V3 Plus framework has recently been disseminated, focusing on usability aspects. So Tracy, I'd love to come back to you. I wonder if you can speak to how usability evaluation and validation might differ or not differ between technologies that are themselves regulated medical devices versus those that are not. You're on mute.
I'm sorry. Regarding that question, I'm not the expert on that particular topic, so I'd rather not comment on that at this time.
Absolutely, no problem. Can we come back to then the topic of burden and how that might be addressed from a a usability perspective in rare diseases?
So in terms of burden, could you ask your question again then?
Yeah, sure. I just mean aspects of how to think about rolling these tools out in such a way that is ideally seamless, meaning that participants can use them without, basically just causing other difficulties in their lives.
So, really the focus on patients and being able to use it, I focus more so on working with patients to understand what's important to them and how they can be engaged within the regulatory environment. And so a lot of what we do is to advise patients and continue to encourage sponsors, industry, other stakeholders to engage patients so that they can share what's important to them early in the development of the device life cycle. And so that would include getting feedback on things about the design of a product and seeing, how beneficial is it? Is it what's currently on the market easy to use? Is it burdensome? What are those needs that may currently exist that could be addressed as new products are being developed? And so one ways that we've done that is, as I said, we encourage the engagement of patients throughout the device life cycle, but we encourage sponsors to start talking with patients about those lived experiences, what those pain points are, and what the unmet treatment options are and limitations of those current options, as well as looking at those design features or other elements that could possibly benefit the patient community. And we also look at ways that they could streamline clinical study plans to be more fit for purpose and to enhance the patient's experience and reduce their barriers to participation in the clinical trial, recruitment and retention. And then we also encouraged sponsors and patients to be engaged after products are on the market so that we can learn from things that are already designed and available to them, so that we could look at ways that maybe there are some burdens. They thought that it was going to work well, but maybe there are some safety concerns that came up or some things that they didn't anticipate that could be improved with the next iteration of a device.
Thanks, Tracy. Yeah, we did talk a lot about patient engagement from the beginning, which is obviously critical, but having that patient voice throughout and thinking about the total life cycle, incredibly important. Christine, you're all about the data. I always enjoy that perspective when I see you present. And of course, generating data to support tools to capture patient-generated health data isn't easy. It takes time. But of course, patients with rare disease don't have time to wait. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the balance between meeting urgent needs, but also that iterative approach to innovation that you referred to.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. I think you highlighted some of the very topic that we're thinking about all the time, right? How do we get some of these very novel tools to the patient, to the developers in a way that we can be confident, but also not really dragging our feet for too long? And I think this, for example, the case study I shared is a good example. I think, we went in and we use patient voice to inform us on what should we focusing on, but we use data to help us define what is that relevant measure that we could be using. Certainly, I think Peter will discuss in the next panel that where the research continue, it's by no means that we're done. This is basically the one measure we can use. I think now we have an opportunity based on some of this experiment we're doing, even though the treatment failed, but the data we collected can help us further refining the measurement that we can now do, right? And then I think that we could even further improve the measurement property and reduce sample size in future trials. But all of them really, we have to take a more of an iterative process. We cannot basically say that this is basically, we have to collect a lot of data, we don't do anything about it until we figure out a perfect solution. I think we really have to be pragmatic and saying, okay, this is good enough, let's do it, and then we'll learn through this process. And I think we'll all be in a better place faster in this process.
Yeah, you're here. Thanks, Christine. So I have one eye on the clock, and I enjoyed the way that the last panel went to kind of burning issues over the last few minutes. So maybe, Kristen, if I can give the floor to you, just to ask you a very general question around, is there a topic we haven't covered yet today that you'd really like to share some thoughts on?
Oh, I think the topics were covered. I think I could add a little bit to the data, right? I mean, Christine's very data-driven, data-focused, and as are we. We're in similar areas, right? And so I agree that, we don't want to get caught up too much in the data so that it prevents us from progressing. But it is important to, have that patient's voice, but analyze the data too to see what is surfacing to the top, right? The answers are going to be in the data. The more we capture, the more we're going to know. Particularly when we move from our experience from a controlled setting to the home, and the data gets messy and things like that. So just importance of focusing on providing some clarity as you move from setting to setting, incorporating that patient voice, and but not dwelling a little bit too long on it, so it's preventing progress. I think we're seeing signals that we can start moving forward with sooner.
Absolutely. And Pam, it looks like you're going to round us out. So I wonder if you can just share a few more thoughts on any topic, but one thing that struck out when you were giving your presentation was around those aspects of diversity.
I think we shouldn't assume anything as it relates to what patients' burdens are and what they know and understand about device development and the regulatory process for approving their use. And I also think in dealing with rare populations, for the most part, people are very eager to engage and support. But they need the framework, they need the context in order to be the best participants they can be. So education and understanding that, meeting people where they are, don't make any assumptions as to what their burdens and issues are, and try to be open to doing things differently are important elements that we take into consideration, and then build relationships, long-term relationships. That's how trust comes to be present.
Thank you, Pam. That's actually a really nice way to conclude our discussion, open-mindedness, meeting people where they are. Thank you very much to everyone for their perspectives. I will hand back to our hosts.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jessie, and thank you, everyone. I think that's a powerful way of reminder to close us out on the session 2 around how do we build that long-term trust as we think about incorporating the patients and their voices as a part of this journey.